Ever wondered what it was like to eat when your Spartan masters could decide whether you lived or died? No takeout, no corner shops, and definitely no mercy. Spartan Helots spent their days working the fields from dawn to dusk, and if they were lucky, they got more than scraps thrown at them like dogs. Welcome to the brutal reality of ancient Spartan survival food, where gourmet meant not getting beaten while you ate whatever you could grow or catch. This was about staying alive when your entire existence depended on keeping your Spartan overlords happy, while somehow finding enough calories to survive another day. The Helots were basically slaves who worked the land so the Spartans could focus on being the ultimate warriors. And trust me, the Spartans didn't care if their Helots ate well, they just needed them alive enough to work. So grab your stomach and prepare for a journey through the most desperate meals in ancient history. And stay till the end, because you won't believe what the most desperate helots had to resort to just to see another sunrise. Starting with number 10, let's talk about black broth scraps. It's something that'll make you appreciate your worst school lunch. You've probably heard of Spartan black broth, that disgusting mixture of pork, blood, salt, and vinegar that even other Greeks thought was awful. Well, guess what the helots got? The scraps, the burnt bits from the bottom of the pot. The watery leftovers that even the Spartans couldn't stomach. Just imagine that you're a helot. You've been working the fields all day, and you're starving. The Spartans finish their meal of black broth, and if you're really lucky, someone might scrape the leftover gunk into a bowl and toss it your way. These were burnt remnants that probably tasted like someone mixed dirt with blood and left it out in the sun. The crazy part is that helots were probably grateful for it. When you're living on the edge of starvation, even the worst leftovers start looking like a feast. These scraps might have had tiny bits of meat clinging to them, or maybe some congealed blood that still had a bit of nutrition. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't tasty, but it was something. And here's the kicker: helots had to eat this stuff while being grateful. Show any sign of disgust or complaint, and you might not get anything at all tomorrow. Or worse, you might get a beating to remind you of your place. So you would choke down that disgusting mixture and say, "Thank you for the privilege." This was survival at its most basic level. The Helots learned to see food not as pleasure, but as fuel. Every drop of that awful broth was calories that could keep them alive another day. And when you're living under a system designed to keep you down, sometimes awful calories are better than no calories at all. Sliding into number 9, it's barley mush. If there was one thing that defined helot survival, it was barley mush. And when I say mush, I mean a soggy, tasteless pile of grain that had about as much flavor as wet cardboard. This wasn't your modern oatmeal with brown sugar and cinnamon. This was survival food that helots ate day after day, week after week, until they probably dreamed about anything else. Here's how it worked. You'd take whatever barley you could get your hands on, and you'd boil it in water until it turned into a thick, greyish paste. No salt, no herbs, no nothing. Just grain and water, cooked until it was soft enough to swallow without choking. The recipe was simple because it had to be. Helots didn't have time for complicated cooking, and they definitely didn't have access to fancy ingredients. You threw your barley in a pot, added water, and hoped you had enough fuel to cook it properly. If you were lucky, you might find a few wild herbs to throw in, but most of the time it was just plain, boring mush. But here's the thing about barley mush that it filled you up. When you're doing backbreaking labor all day, you need something that'll stick to your ribs, even if it tastes like nothing. This stuff was heavy, dense, and would keep you going for hours. It wasn't exciting, but it was reliable. The worst part? You'd eat the same thing for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Day after day, month after month. Imagine waking up every morning, knowing you're going to eat the exact same flavorless paste you ate yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. It's enough to drive anyone crazy, but Helots didn't have a choice. Coming in at number 8, we have wild green stew. When you're at the bottom of the food chain, you learn to eat whatever nature provides. And in ancient Sparta, that meant wild greens, lots of them. We're talking about dandelions, wild spinach, bitter herbs, and anything else that grew in the rocky soil that helots could stuff in their mouths without dying. This wasn't a trendy salad bar situation. These were tough, bitter plants that most people today wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, but helots learned to make them into a kind of stew, boiling them down until they were soft enough to eat and hopefully removing some of that bitter taste that made your face scrunch up. The process was simple but time consuming. You'd spend whatever free time you had searching for edible plants, dandelion leaves, wild amaranth, lamb's quarters, anything green that wasn't poisonous. Then you would take these bitter, tough leaves and boil them in whatever water you could find. The result was a green, slimy mess that tasted like someone had mixed grass clippings with pond water. But you know what? It had vitamins. It had nutrients that kept helots from getting sick and dying. When you're living on mostly grain and scraps, these wild greens were probably the only thing keeping scurvy and other diseases at bay. The smart helots learned which plants were edible and which ones would kill you. This wasn't knowledge you could afford to get wrong. Eat the wrong leaf, and you'd be dead by morning. But the ones who survived learned to identify dozens of different plants, knowing which ones were bitter but safe and which ones were worth the risk. And here's the crazy part. This green sludge probably kept more helots alive than any other single food. While the Spartans were eating their meat and grain, the helots were getting essential nutrients from these wild plants that their masters completely ignored. Sometimes being at the bottom means you learn things that the people on top never figured out. At number 7, meet the survival food that took patience: acorn bread. When even barley was too expensive or too scarce, helots turned to something that was free and available: acorns. Yeah, you heard that right. The same nuts that squirrels fight over became a staple food for desperate helots, trying to survive another day under Spartan rule. But you can't just pick them up and eat them like peanuts. Raw acorns are full of bitter tannins that will make you sick and taste absolutely horrible. So helots had to learn a complicated process to make them edible, which took time and effort they barely had. First, you had to collect the acorns, which meant competing with squirrels and other animals for the good ones. Then came the hard part: processing them. You'd have to shell them, grind them up, and then leach out all the bitter tannins by soaking the ground acorns in water for days or weeks. The process was exhausting. You'd grind the acorns between rocks, creating a coarse flour that looked nothing like the smooth grain flour we're used to. Then, you would put this flour in baskets and pour water over it, over and over again, until the water ran clear instead of brown. This could take weeks, and you had to change the water constantly. Once you finally got the bitterness out, you could make a kind of bread. But don't picture fluffy loaves fresh from the oven. This was dense, heavy, and had a weird nutty taste that took some getting used to. It was filling, sure, but it was also hard to digest and didn't taste like anything you want to eat by choice. The crazy part is that acorn bread was actually pretty nutritious. Acorns are packed with calories, protein, and fats that helots desperately needed. So even though the process was incredibly time-consuming and the result wasn't exactly delicious, it kept people alive when nothing else was available. Moving to number 6, it's the fish heads and bones. Living near the coast had its advantages, even for helots. When Spartan fishermen brought in their catch, there were always leftovers, the parts nobody wanted. Fish heads, bones, scales, and guts that would normally get thrown away became precious protein for desperate helots. This wasn't pretty eating. We're talking about fish heads with the eyes still in them, spines with tiny bits of meat clinging to the bones, and internal organs that most people wouldn't touch with a stick. But when you're starving, you learn to see these scraps as treasure. The trick was knowing how to cook them properly. You couldn't just throw a fish head in a pot and hope for the best. Helots learned to make a kind of soup, boiling the heads and bones for hours until whatever meat was left fell off and the bones became soft enough to eat. Fish head soup was actually pretty nutritious. even if it looked disgusting. The heads contained brain matter that was full of fats and proteins, and the bones provided calcium and other minerals. The eyes were considered a delicacy by some helots, even though they probably tasted like fishy jelly. What you ended up with was a cloudy, fishy broth with bits of meat and soft bones floating in it. It didn't look appetizing, and it definitely didn't smell great, but it was protein and calories that the helots desperately needed. Sometimes helots would dry fish scraps in the sun, creating a kind of jerky that would last longer. These dried fish bits were tough and salty, but they were portable protein that could be eaten while working in the fields. At number 5, witness the waste that became sustenance: olive pulp cakes. Sparta was surrounded by olive groves, and where there are olives, there's olive oil production. And where there's olive oil production, there's waste. Means the pulp and pits left over after pressing the olives. Most people threw this stuff away, but helots couldn't afford to waste anything edible. After the olives were pressed for oil, what was left was a moist, fibrous pulp that still had some nutrition in it. It tasted bitter and had a weird texture, but desperate helots learned to make it into a kind of cake that could fill their stomachs when nothing else was available. The process was simple, but required creativity. You take the olive pulp, mix it with whatever flour or grain you could find, add water, and form it into flat cakes. Then, you'd cook these cakes on hot stones, or in the ashes of a fire, creating something that was technically bread but tasted like bitter, oily cardboard. These olive pulp cakes were incredibly dense and hard to digest. They sat in your stomach like rocks and had a greasy, bitter aftertaste that lingered for hours. But they were filling, and they had calories and fats that helots needed to survive hard physical labor. The smart thing about olive pulp was that it was usually free for the taking. The olive oil producers were happy to get rid of their waste, so helots could often collect as much as they could carry. This made it a reliable food source during times when even other scraps were hard to come by. Coming in at number 4, we have insect protein. When even the worst scraps weren't available, helots turned to something that was always around. Insects, grasshoppers, crickets, beetle larvae, and anything else that crawled or flew became fair game for desperate people trying to get enough protein to survive. This wasn't exotic cuisine or adventurous eating. This was pure desperation. When you're watching your children starve and there's nothing else available, you learn to see insects as food instead of pests. The most common insects helots ate were probably grasshoppers and crickets. These were easy to catch in large numbers, especially during swarming seasons. You'd go out in the early morning when the insects were sluggish from the cold and collect as many as you could carry. The preparation was simple, but required a strong stomach. You'd remove the wings and legs, which were too tough to eat, and then roast the bodies over a fire until they were crispy. The result was something that crunched like nuts but tasted like, well, insects. Grasshoppers weren't actually that bad once you got used to them. They had a nutty flavor and provided protein that the helots desperately needed. The hard part was getting over the mental barrier of eating something that most people considered disgusting. The biggest challenge with insect eating was finding enough of them to make a real meal. It takes a lot of grasshoppers to equal the protein in even a small piece of meat. So helots had to spend considerable time and energy collecting enough insects to make it worthwhile. At number 3, let's talk about the bark bread. During the worst famines, when even insects were scarce, helots turned to something that was always available: tree bark. Certain types of bark, especially from pine and birch trees, could be processed into a flour substitute that would keep people alive when absolutely nothing else was available. This wasn't something you'd try for fun. Bark bread was the food of absolute last resort, the thing you ate when the alternative was starving to death. The process was incredibly labor intensive and the result was barely edible, but it provided calories and nutrients that could mean the difference between life and death. The process started with identifying the right trees. Not all bark was edible, some could make you sick or even kill you. But experienced helots learned to recognize pine and birch bark that could be safely eaten. You'd peel off the outer bark to get to the soft inner layer, which was where the nutrition was. Next came the back-breaking work. You'd have to scrape off the inner bark, dry it in the sun, and then grind it into a coarse flour using rocks or whatever tools you could find. This flour was brown, fibrous, and had a woody taste that never quite went away. Making bread from bark flour was tricky. The bark didn't have the same properties as grain flour, so it didn't hold together well. You'd mix it with water and maybe some regular flour if you had any, then form it into flat cakes that you'd cook on hot stones. The result was something that barely qualified as bread. It was dense, tough, and had a bitter, woody taste that made your mouth pucker. It was also hard to digest and didn't provide as much nutrition as real grain. But when you're starving, even bark bread starts to look like a feast. Leading up to number 2, we have the blood pudding scraps. When animals were slaughtered for the Spartan masters, absolutely nothing was wasted, including the blood. While the Spartans might get the prime cuts of meat, helots learned to make use of every single part of the animal, even creating a kind of blood pudding from blood they could collect. This wasn't the fancy blood sausage you might find in some European cuisines today. This was desperate cooking. Using animal blood helots could get their hands on including pig, goat, sheep, or anything else that bled. The challenge was getting access to fresh blood in the first place. Helots had to be quick and clever, collecting blood when animals were butchered, and before their masters decided they wanted it for themselves. This often meant sneaking around during slaughter time and hoping nobody noticed you collecting what they considered waste. You'd mix the blood with barley meal, chopped onions if you had them, and whatever herbs you could find. Then you'd cook it all together until it formed a thick, dark mass. The result was something that looked pretty gruesome but was actually packed with iron and protein. Blood pudding was incredibly nutritious, providing helots with nutrients they couldn't get from their usual diet of grain and vegetables. It tasted metallic and rich, which took some getting used to, but it was a way to make the precious protein go further when you were feeding a family on scraps. And finally, at number 1, we have the survival drink that lasted for months, fermented grain slurry. Sometimes helots would let their grain go slightly bad on purpose, creating a fermented slurry that was part food, part alcohol. Fermented foods could last longer than fresh ones, and the alcohol provided calories and helped kill harmful bacteria. The process happened almost by accident at first. Grain that got wet and was left sitting would start to ferment naturally. Instead of throwing it away, desperate helots learned that this fermented mush was not only edible, but actually provided more calories than regular grain. Making fermented grain slurry was simple, but required patience. You'd take your grain, add water, and let it sit in a warm place for several days or weeks. Wild yeast in the air would start the fermentation process, creating a bubbling, sour-smelling mixture that was technically alcoholic. The result was a thick, sour slurry that had a sharp, tangy taste and a slight alcoholic kick. It wasn't pleasant to drink, but it was nutritious and provided quick energy. The fermentation process also created vitamins that weren't present in regular grain, making it more nutritious than the original ingredients. This fermented slurry could be stored for weeks or even months without spoiling, making it perfect for helots who needed to save food for harder times. It was like having a food preservation system that didn't require any special equipment or knowledge. The slight alcohol content also helped kill harmful bacteria and parasites that might be present in questionable water or food. In a time when clean water wasn't guaranteed, anything that helped prevent illness was valuable for survival. These meals represent the human spirit's refusal to give up. When faced with a system designed to crush them, helots found ways to live, to feed their families, and to maintain their humanity even in the darkest circumstances. So, the next time you complain about your dinner, remember the helots who made meals from tree bark and insect protein. Remember the people who turned olive waste into bread and snail slime into stew. They didn't eat these things because they wanted to, but because they refused to die. And maybe, just maybe, We can learn something from their determination, not just about survival, but to find hope in hopeless situations and to create life from the scraps that others throw away. The Helots may have been at the bottom of Spartan society, but their survival skills were second to none.